In the deep quiet of a Virginia night, the land itself seemed to hold its breath. The moon hung low, casting silver light over fields where tobacco once grew tall and proud. But in August of 1831, those same fields would drink something far darker than rain. Before dawn broke, 55 souls would lie dead, not by disease, not by nature, but by the hands of the enslaved. For over a century, history would try to forget this moment. But buried truth has a way of whispering back to life. And in Southampton County, Virginia, it began with one man who claimed that God himself had spoken to him. His name was Nathaniel Turner. The world would remember him as Nat Turner, the prophet of death. Part 1. The Sign Beneath the Sun. Southampton County, Virginia, August 1831. The air was thick and heavy, the kind that sticks to your skin. People in the small town of Jerusalem were used to the humidity, used to the creak of wooden porches and the sound of insects buzzing through the night. But this week, something felt wrong. The dogs barked more than usual. The birds seemed quieter. And when the wind blew through the trees, it sounded like the land was warning them, something was coming. The newspapers wouldn't print the full story. The courthouse would later lock away testimonies for decades. But on that night, a story unfolded that would shake the South to its bones. Because what happened in those fields wasn't random madness, it was a rebellion born from centuries of pain. To understand it, we have to go back 3 decades. Nat Turner was born into bondage on October 2, 1800, on the farm of Benjamin Turner. His mother, Nancy, had been torn from her home in Africa. She never forgot what freedom felt like, and she made sure her son didn't either. She told him stories, not fairy tales, but warnings, about chains, whips, and the sea that swallowed her past. And from those stories grew a boy with fire in his heart. Nat's father escaped when he was young, vanishing into the night and leaving behind a single truth: freedom was possible. That thought became a seed that took root deep in Nat's mind. But Nat was different from other children on the plantation. He learned faster, listened deeper, and saw things others didn't. He learned to read and write, something most enslaved children were forbidden to do. The Turners found it amusing, a little boy reading the Bible, quoting scripture. They didn't realize they were raising a prophet. Nat's faith became his power. He read the Bible not as a book of comfort, but as a book of warning and justice. He saw himself in Moses, in David, in every man who had been chosen to deliver his people. The older he got, the stronger his visions became. Sometimes, Nat would speak of things he couldn't have known. Once, as a boy, he described events that had happened before he was born, and described them perfectly. The elders whispered that he had a gift. Others said it was a curse. Then one day, when he was 21, Nat ran away. For 30 days, he tasted freedom, living in the woods, hiding in the swamps, sleeping under the stars. But then, something no one could explain happened. He came back. He told the others that the Spirit had spoken to him, commanding his return. He wasn't meant to flee, not yet. His mission was not escape. It was judgment. Years passed. Nat waited, watched, and preached. His sermons were quiet storms, full of fire. He spoke of equality, of God's justice, of the day when the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. People listened. Some were afraid. Others believed he really was chosen. By 1828, the visions came more often. He saw blood on the corn, fire in the sky, and men crying out in the fields. He believed these were signs of what was to come. When he was sold to Joseph Travis, people said Nat was lucky. Travis was no monster. He didn't whip for fun or starve his slaves. But slavery isn't softened by kindness. A gilded cage is still a cage. Nat's wife, Cherry, and their 2 children belonged to another man, Giles Reese. He could visit sometimes, but they weren't his to keep. One day, Reese's son used Nat's little boy as collateral for a debt, as if his child were no more than a coin or a cow. That was the moment something broke inside Nat Turner. Then, on February 12, 1831, the sky changed. People across Virginia looked up and saw the sun darken. The center turned black, leaving only a ring of burning fire. Some called it an eclipse. Nat called it a message. To him, it was a black hand reaching across the sun, a signal from heaven itself. The time had come. That night, as others prayed for rain or crops, Nat Turner prayed for courage. He began to move in secret, meeting under the cover of night with men he trusted. He chose them carefully, not for their size or strength, but for their faith. There was Hark, called Hercules for his might. Henry, calm and thoughtful. Nelson, quiet but steady. And Sam, whose master lived near the Travis place. They met in the woods, their whispers swallowed by the crickets. Nat spoke to them not as a man, but as a messenger. He told them that the Lord had shown him a path that led through blood to freedom. Brothers, he said, his voice low, the time is at hand. The angel of death rides on the wind. The great day of judgment is near. The men stared into the fire, the flames flickering in their eyes. They knew what he meant. They knew what he was asking. They nodded. One by one, they agreed. The plan had begun, and when the next sign appeared in the heavens, another strange light across the sky, they would rise. They would kill. They would burn. They would make the earth remember their names. End of part 1. Next in part 2, the blood moon rises. The first blows fall, and the rebellion begins in the house of Joseph Travis, with a blade and a prayer. Would you like me to continue with part 2, 1000 words, same YouTube story style? Title: The Prophet's Shadow, The Rebellion Ignites, Part 2. It began under the cover of darkness, in the quiet hours when even the crickets had fallen silent. A handful of enslaved men, armed with axes and faith, prepared to strike at the heart of an empire built on their suffering. They knew the odds were impossible. They knew death was almost certain. But they also knew one truth that burned brighter than fear: better to die fighting for freedom than live forever in chains. What came next would burn itself into America's memory as one of the bloodiest nights in its history. This was not just rebellion. This was reckoning. Part 2. The Night of the Hatchet. Nat Turner's men had chosen their moment carefully. For weeks, they had moved in silence, whispering only when the wind was loud enough to hide their voices. Their plan was more than a plot, it was a prayer turned into action. They had wanted to begin on July 4, 1831, Independence Day. The irony was deliberate. On the day white America celebrated its freedom, these enslaved men would demand their own. But fate, or perhaps something more mysterious, intervened. Nat fell ill, too weak to rise. The day passed quietly, the fireworks exploding for others, not for them. Yet Nat took it as another sign. He believed that when the time was right, the heavens would tell him. And a few weeks later, the sky spoke again. On August 13, 1831, the people of Southampton County looked up and saw the sun change color. The air turned strange, tinted with green and blue. Even white residents wrote in their journals about it, unnerved by the sight. Today, scientists say it was caused by volcanic dust drifting across the Atlantic. But Nat Turner didn't need science. To him, it was prophecy fulfilled. The hour had come. 8 days later, on Sunday, August 21st, the woods near Cabin Pond were alive with the hum of cicadas and the crackle of a small fire. 7 men sat around it, roasting a pig, one last meal before destiny called. The air was thick, humid, and heavy, the kind of heat that made it hard to breathe. 2 new men had joined the group that day: Jack, Hark's brother-in-law, and Will, a man with a quiet fury in his eyes. Will had long carried a rage so deep it had nearly swallowed him whole. Nat saw it not as weakness but as strength, a fire waiting for purpose. They prayed, ate, and spoke softly of what was to come. The plan was clear. They would move under the cover of night, from house to house, killing the families who claimed to own them, gathering weapons and recruits as they went. Their final goal was the town of Jerusalem, where an armory waited. Once armed, they would rally every enslaved person they could find and retreat into the Great Dismal Swamp, a wild, endless maze where no white militia would dare follow. By midnight, their fate was sealed. At around 2 in the morning, Monday, August 22, Nat Turner and his small band approached the home of Joseph Travis. The farmhouse stood quiet, lit only by moonlight filtering through the trees. A ladder was placed against the wall. Nat climbed first, his bare feet soundless on the wood. He slipped through an upstairs window and crept through the shadows until his fingers found the latch of the front door. Slowly, he opened it and motioned for the others to enter. Inside, the Travis family slept peacefully: Joseph, his wife Sally, her young son Putnam, a baby, and a boy named Joel who worked as an apprentice. Nat reached for a hatchet. He raised it high, then brought it down, but the blow missed its mark. Joseph Travis awoke with a scream. In that instant, the silence shattered. Will, driven by a fury that had waited a lifetime, swung his axe. The rebellion had begun. One by one, they killed everyone in the house. The screams stopped. The night grew still again. Before they left, someone remembered the baby. Nat's eyes closed briefly. The act that followed was merciless but, to them, necessary. No witnesses. No warnings. They took the Travis family's weapons, flintlock muskets, old but usable, and their horses. Nat took Joseph's sword. It would become his symbol for the next 48 hours, gleaming in the rising dawn like divine judgment. In the gray light of morning, Nat Turner led his men into the yard. There, he used the sword to drill them in formation, as if they were soldiers in a holy army. Austin, another enslaved man from the Travis farm, joined them, swelling their number to 8. Their next stop was the home of Salathiel Francis, a poor white farmer. He was killed as he slept. His enslaved man fled into the woods, and though they fired after him, he escaped. At each home, the rebels faced the same choice: speed or thoroughness. Too slow, and someone could warn the others. Too fast, and a survivor might spread word of their approach. By the time they reached Piety Reese's farm, Nat faced a painful test. His wife Cherry and their children were enslaved there. He could see the house where his family slept. He could go to them, embrace them, maybe even take them along. But he didn't. He kept walking. Whether it was discipline, fear, or divine resolve, no one knows. Perhaps he knew this was not a rescue, it was a war. They killed Piety Reese, her son, and the overseer. Then they moved on. As the sun climbed higher, their ranks began to grow. From neighboring farms, enslaved men joined them, armed with whatever they could carry: axes, knives, pitchforks, muskets. Others refused, frozen by terror or loyalty, or perhaps both. Nat didn't blame them. Freedom demanded more than courage, it demanded sacrifice. At Elizabeth Turner's plantation, they struck again, killing the widow, her neighbor Mrs. Newsom, and the overseer. There, the group divided. Hark took 6 men on foot, while Nat rode ahead with 9 others toward the Whitehead place. The Whitehead farm was large, and inside were several women, an elderly matriarch, and a child. The attack was brutal, and by its end, it was the bloodiest yet. When one of the Whitehead daughters, Margaret, fled into the fields, Nat Turner himself gave chase. He caught her near a fence. In that moment, something inside him hardened. He raised his sword. It was the only time Nat Turner personally took a life. Why he had others kill but spared his own hands until that moment remains a mystery. Maybe his visions hadn't prepared him for what real blood looked like. Maybe he wanted to show his men he shared their burden. Either way, the prophet had crossed a line from which he could never return. By noon, 45 people lay dead across Southampton County. The rebels, now 60 strong, marched toward Jerusalem. They believed they were an unstoppable tide. But fate had other plans. A few survivors had escaped, spreading the alarm faster than the rebels could travel. White families fled to Jerusalem. Militias formed. Guns were loaded. The element of surprise, their only real weapon, was gone. By afternoon, the rebels clashed with armed whites at James Parker's farm. Gunfire split the air. Though the rebels outnumbered the defenders, they lacked training. Their weapons misfired. The line broke. They fell back, disorganized and shaken. Still, Nat Turner tried to rally them. He led his followers toward Thomas Ridley's plantation, hoping for food, rest, and new recruits. But as they camped that night, surrounded by darkness and fear, reality began to sink in. They had struck like lightning. But the storm was already closing in. Somewhere in the distance, dogs barked. The sound of horses echoed faintly through the trees. The militia was coming. By dawn, Panic set in. Someone heard movement in the woods, friend or foe, no one knew. A shout rang out, confusion spread, and before Nat could restore order, several men broke and ran into the dark. The rebellion was splintering before his eyes. End of Part 2. Next in Part 3, the militia descends. The rebels scatter, and Nat Turner, once the prophet of liberation, becomes a hunted ghost among the swamps of Virginia. Would you like me to continue with Part 3, 1000 words, same YouTube cinematic storytelling style? Title: The Blood of the Rebellion, Nat Turner's Final Stand, Part 3 inches. The night was thick with fear and gunpowder. The rebellion that had begun with divine fire was now reduced to smoke and whispers. Nat Turner, once a preacher turned prophet of vengeance, was now a ghost hunted by thousands. The fields of Southampton dripped not only with the sweat of labor but with blood, black and white alike. The question echoing through the swamps wasn't who had rebelled, it was who would survive the reckoning. Part 3. The Wrath of Retribution. When Nat Turner and his exhausted followers crept back into camp, they expected cheers and rest. Instead, they found panic. Shadows moved like frightened spirits among the trees, men shouting in confusion. Fear had broken whatever unity the rebels once had. By dawn, half of Turner's army had vanished into the woods, leaving only silence and the sound of their own defeat. Still, Turner refused to surrender to despair. On Tuesday, August 23, he led what was left of his band toward Samuel Blunt's plantation. He believed the place abandoned, a final chance to strike. But he was wrong. Blunt and 5 armed white men had turned the house into a fortress. As the rebels approached, the night erupted with gunfire. The shots echoed across the fields like thunder from heaven. Men screamed, horses reared, the rebellion broke apart in an instant. Turner was separated from his followers as chaos swallowed them whole. By sunrise, the dream of freedom had turned into smoke. Less than 48 hours after the rebellion began, the uprising was crushed. Across Southampton County, white militias poured in like a flood. What had begun as an act of defiance now unleashed a storm of vengeance that would stain Virginia's soul forever. Within days, nearly 3,000 armed men swarmed the county, militia, federal soldiers, and volunteers hungry for blood. The number of white men with weapons now outnumbered the very people they claimed to protect. What followed was not justice, but terror. Mobs roamed the countryside, killing anyone they suspected of aiding the rebellion. There were no trials, no questions, no mercy. To them, black skin was guilt enough. A Richmond newspaper editor later wrote that the white retribution was hardly inferior in barbarity to the atrocities of the rebels. Along the dirt roads, heads were placed on poles, gruesome warnings to anyone who might dream of freedom again. Entire families were slaughtered. Innocent people, men, women, and children, paid for the fear that now consumed the South. One militia from North Carolina killed 40 black people in a single day, their captain later scolding them not for murder, but for stealing money and jewelry from the dead. "You're robbing from their masters," he said coldly. To them, even in death, the enslaved were still considered property. Captured rebels were brought before special courts known as Courts of Oyer and Termine. There were no juries, only judges determined to make examples. Trials lasted minutes. Sentences were swift. Dozens were hanged. Others were sold into the Deep South, a punishment worse than death. And yet, Nat Turner himself remained a phantom. For 10 long weeks, he eluded capture. While Southampton County drowned in paranoia, he stayed hidden within miles of where the rebellion had begun. It was as if the land itself sheltered him, its swamps, roots, and shadows conspiring to keep him alive. His first hiding place was a marvel of desperation. A fallen pine tree had left a gaping hollow beneath its roots, and Turner turned that hollow into a secret cave. He lined the floor with pine needles, covered the entrance with rails and leaves, and vanished into the earth. For 6 weeks, he lay in that suffocating darkness. No light, no comfort, just heat, insects, and the muffled sounds of men hunting him. Outside, dogs barked, muskets fired, voices shouted. Inside, he waited, silent as the grave. At night, he crept to a small spring to drink and relieve himself before slipping back into his hole before dawn. Food came from those who still dared to believe in him, enslaved people risking their own lives to leave him cornbread and sweet potatoes hidden beneath the soil. One woman, remembered only as a negress from the vicinity, became his lifeline. Her name was lost to history, but her courage lived on in the whispers of freedom's faithful. Imagine the torment of those weeks, the prophet of rebellion trapped in a tomb of his own making. He knew that people were dying because of him. He knew that his wife had been tortured, that children had been killed, that homes burned because of his dream. Yet he stayed silent, and above ground, Southampton went mad. White families barricaded themselves in their homes, clutching rifles through sleepless nights. Mothers kept their children hidden. Men patrolled the fields in terror. Rumors of new uprisings spread like wildfire. Every noise, every rustle of leaves became a threat. Fear turned the county into a prison. Governor John Floyd in Richmond received frantic letters. To him and many others, it was unthinkable that enslaved men could organize such a rebellion without Northern influence. The idea of black intelligence and leadership terrified them. So they blamed abolitionists, foreign agitators, anyone but themselves. Laws grew harsher, patrols more brutal. Across the South, chains tightened. The faint hope that slavery might someday fade away was buried under the ashes of Turner's rebellion. After 6 weeks underground, Turner's supplies ran out. His protectors could no longer approach without risking death. He made a choice, to move again, under the cover of darkness. For 2 weeks, he wandered the forests and swamps of Southampton, ghost-like. He listened to conversations through cabin walls, learning what had become of his men. Most were dead, the rest were waiting for trial in the town of Jerusalem. The rebellion was over. The price of freedom was being paid in blood. One night, while drinking from a stream, Turner heard dogs barking in the distance. Searchers were near. He climbed a tree, pressing himself flat against the trunk, as torches flickered beneath him. The men passed close enough that he could smell the whiskey on their breath. He did not move. He did not breathe. The prophet who had once brought a county to its knees now hung above it in silence, watching, waiting, praying for a sign from the God who had once spoken to him in visions. But heaven was silent. To be continued in Part 4. Call to action. If this story gripped your soul, hit subscribe, like, and share this video. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Nat Turner's place? Stay tuned for Part 4, where the hunter finally meets the hunted. Would you like me to continue with Part 4, the capture and confession of Nat Turner, in the same cinematic storytelling style for your YouTube audience? Title: The Blood of the Rebellion, Nat Turner's Final Stand, Part 4 inches. For 70 long days, the forests of Southampton whispered the name Nat Turner. He had become a legend, a ghost, a nightmare that haunted both the living and the dead. Mothers warned their children not to speak his name after dark. Soldiers swore they saw his shadow moving through the mist. But in truth, Nat Turner was no spirit. He was a starving man hiding among the trees, waiting for the day the Lord would speak again. The rebellion was over, but his story was far from finished. Part 4. The Prophet in the Shadows. By the time the leaves began to turn and the air grew cool, Nat Turner had been hiding for more than 2 months. His cave beneath the fallen pine had become unbearable, too hot, too small, too close to death. The smell of damp earth clung to his skin. His body had wasted away, his clothes torn and filthy, his hair tangled with pine needles. Yet his mind, though exhausted, burned with restless visions. At night, when the moonlight slipped through the branches, he crept through the woods like a ghost. He moved silently, always near the swamps, avoiding open ground. He watched from a distance as white men patrolled the roads, their muskets shining in the light of their torches. The county had become a military zone. Checkpoints guarded every road. Farmers had turned their barns into prisons. Even those who had nothing to do with the rebellion were too afraid to move freely. But fear cuts both ways. The same terror that drove the white militias also helped Turner remain unseen. They were so frightened of him that they imagined him everywhere, in every shadow, in every sound. And while they chased ghosts, the real Nat Turner crept through their midst, alive and watching. He found temporary refuge in the woods near a small creek. The place was quiet and hidden by thickets of cane. There, he dug a shallow hole and covered it with branches, using it as a place to rest during the day. At night, he searched for food. Sometimes he stole corn from nearby fields. Sometimes he found wild berries or small animals. Once, he discovered the carcass of a deer left by hunters and cut away what meat he could before the morning light. But hunger was not his only companion. Loneliness gnawed at him even more. The rebellion that had once filled him with divine purpose now felt like a dream fading into dust. He thought of his wife, tortured and broken. He thought of the men who had followed him, men who had believed that God himself had chosen them to fight. Now they were gone, dead or hanging from gallows in the town square. Their blood had become the ink in which history would write its cruel lessons. Still, Turner could not bring himself to surrender. In his heart, he believed that every prophet had to walk through darkness before the dawn. He waited for a sign. One night, he approached a small cabin at the edge of a field. He knew the family who lived there, enslaved people who had once listened to his sermons. He didn't dare speak to them, but he left a small mark near the doorway, a secret symbol that only those who had followed him would recognize. The next night, a small bundle appeared beneath a tree near the creek. Inside was cornbread, a piece of salted pork, and a note written on scrap paper, "Still we pray for you." Tears burned in his eyes. Somewhere, despite all the death and terror, there were still those who believed in him. That belief gave him strength. Days passed into weeks. The search for Turner continued, but the fury had cooled. Many of the militiamen had returned home, though patrols still combed the woods. Some believed Turner had fled north. Others swore he was hiding in the Great Dismal Swamp. There were even whispers that he had vanished into thin air, taken up into heaven like Elijah. But heaven had not claimed him yet. He remained among the living, though each day brought him closer to capture. One evening, while moving along the edge of a field, he saw smoke rising in the distance. Drawn by curiosity and hunger, he crept closer and found an abandoned cabin. The roof sagged, the chimney leaned, but there was shelter inside. He made it his new hiding place. There, in the flickering light of a single candle, he scratched marks into the wooden wall, verses he remembered from the Bible, words that had guided him since childhood. He prayed aloud in the darkness. He asked God why he had given him a vision only to let it end in blood. He asked why the innocent had been punished. He begged for meaning. For days, there was no answer. Only silence. Then, one night, as he lay staring at the rafters, he dreamed again. In the dream, he stood in a field of fire. The earth burned beneath his feet, but he did not feel pain. Above him, the moon turned red as blood. From its light, a voice spoke, not the thunderous voice of command he had once heard, but a quiet, mournful whisper. "The time is done," it said. "Rest now." When Turner awoke, the forest outside was still. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees. For the first time, he felt peace, not victory, not triumph, but peace. The rebellion had failed, but his purpose had not been in vain. He believed his death would become a seed, planted in blood, that one day would grow into freedom for others. And so, he waited for fate to come. He did not have to wait long. On October 30th, 10 weeks after the rebellion, a farmer named Benjamin Phipps was walking through the woods near his property. He saw something strange in the underbrush, an opening covered with branches. He called out, but there was no reply. He moved closer, nudging the pile with his musket. Suddenly, the leaves shifted, and a face looked up at him. Nat Turner's face. Phipps raised his gun, but Turner did not move. He looked calm, even relieved. Slowly, he stood and raised his hands. "Do not be afraid," he said quietly. "I am ready." Phipps tied him and led him toward town. Along the road, people gathered, shouting, cursing, spitting. Some wanted to kill him on the spot. Others stared in disbelief, as though seeing a ghost return from the grave. When they reached Jerusalem, Turner was placed in chains. The rebellion's prophet, the man who had terrified an entire state, was finally captured. Yet even in captivity, there was something unbroken in his eyes, a quiet fire that refused to die. The trials, the confessions, and the final reckoning were still to come. But that night, in the cell where he was held, Nat Turner knelt and whispered one final prayer, "Thy will be done." To be continued in Part 5. Would you like me to continue Part 5? The Confession of Nat Turner, in the same emotional, cinematic storytelling style for your YouTube series. Title: The Confession of Nat Turner, Part 5 Inches. When the door to Nat Turner's cell closed, the world outside erupted in cheers and curses. To the people of Southampton, the devil himself had been caught. But to others, watching quietly from behind barred windows or from the shadows of the fields, a dangerous thought began to take root: maybe the devil wasn't Nat Turner at all. Maybe he was the only man who had dared to call evil by its true name. Part 5. The Confession of Nat Turner. The small jail in Jerusalem, Virginia, was little more than a brick box with iron bars and a single window high above the floor. That was where Nat Turner spent his final days, chained hand and foot. The walls were damp, the floor hard, and the air thick with the smell of sweat and decay. Outside, guards kept watch day and night, not because they feared he would escape, but because they feared what others might do to him before the trial. Word of his capture spread fast. Within hours, crowds began arriving from miles around. Some came to see the monster they had heard about. Others came just to make sure he was real, that the ghost who had haunted their nights was now a man in chains. They shouted insults through the bars, called him a murderer, a demon, a beast. But Turner never responded. He just sat quietly, his head bowed, his eyes calm and distant. The authorities, unsure of what to do with such a figure, called for Thomas Ruffin Gray, a local lawyer who had already been writing about the rebellion. Gray had a plan. He would interview Nat Turner, record his words, and publish them. He said it would be, for the public good, but everyone knew what it really was, a chance to make a name for himself. On November 1, 1831, Gray entered the cell with paper, ink, and questions. He found Turner seated on the floor, his wrists and ankles bound with heavy chains. The room was dim, the only light coming from the narrow slit of the window. Turner looked thin but not broken. His voice, when he spoke, was soft, almost gentle, yet filled with conviction. "Do you know who I am?" Gray asked. Turner looked up. "You are a man sent to hear what the Lord has spoken through me." Those were his first recorded words. Gray began writing. For hours each day, he questioned Turner about the rebellion, how it began, who was involved, why he believed God had chosen him. Turner answered everything, not with pride or regret, but with the calm certainty of someone who had seen visions others could not. He told Gray about his childhood. How he had been different from other children, how he saw things, lights in the sky, messages written on leaves, the voices that spoke to him when no one else was around. He spoke of the solar eclipse that he believed was a sign, of the strange green sun, of the dreams that told him the time had come. Gray pressed him. "Do you feel guilt for what happened?" Turner's eyes lifted slowly. Was Moses guilty when he struck down the Egyptian? He asked. Was Joshua guilty when he took the city by the sword? The Lord has his purposes. I am only his servant. Gray wrote every word, though later he would twist them to fit his own version of the story. Each session grew more intense. Guards often stood outside the cell, pretending not to listen but hanging on every word. Some said they saw light flicker in the room even when there was no candle burning. Others swore they heard Turner whispering prayers in languages they didn't understand. Despite his chains, he remained composed. When food was brought, he thanked his captors. When people spat at him through the bars, he simply closed his eyes and prayed. One soldier later told a newspaper that he felt more fear standing in that cell than he had during the rebellion itself. "He looked at me," the man said, "and I thought, he knows something we don't." As the days passed, Gray became obsessed. He wanted to understand how a man so soft-spoken, so intelligent, could justify such horror. Turner told him it was not about revenge. It was not for hate, he said. It was for freedom, for light to be brought into darkness. Those words unsettled Gray. They didn't fit the story he wanted to tell. In his heart, he began to fear that some might read Turner's words and see not a monster, but a martyr. Outside the jail, the crowd grew more violent. Rumors spread that an abolitionist group planned to rescue Turner. Militias doubled the guards. Bonfires burned through the night. People wanted blood, But Turner remained calm, almost serene. He spent hours staring through the small window, watching the sky change from blue to crimson to black. Once, a guard asked him what he was looking at. "The signs," he said. "The heavens still speak." The morning of his trial arrived cold and gray. Turner was led through the streets, chains rattling, surrounded by soldiers. The crowd screamed and cursed, but some fell silent as he passed, unnerved by the steady way he walked. He was thinner now, but his eyes shone bright, unafraid. Inside the courtroom, there was no jury. Just the judges, the lawyers, and the cold air of certainty. The outcome had already been decided before the trial began. He was charged with leading a rebellion, with murder, with treason against the state of Virginia. When asked if he had anything to say in his defense, Nat Turner rose slowly. The room went silent. "I am not guilty of sin," he said. "I acted as the Lord commanded me. You may judge me now, but soon you shall be judged." No one spoke. Even Gray, sitting in the back, felt the chill of those words. It took less than an hour for the judges to declare the sentence, death by hanging. When they read it aloud, Turner simply nodded. "The blood of the innocent and the guilty cries out from the ground," he said. "And the Lord hears it all." That night, Gray visited him one last time. "Do you fear what comes tomorrow?" he asked. Turner smiled faintly. "No man can kill what God has already freed." The next morning, November 11, 1831, dawned clear and cold. The town square filled with people. Some came for vengeance. Some came for justice. Others came for spectacle. At the gallows, Nat Turner climbed the steps without trembling. He looked out at the faces before him, angry, terrified, curious, and said quietly, "The truth will not die with me." The trapdoor fell. Silence followed. But if the crowd expected peace, they found none. For even in death, Nat Turner's presence lingered. His rebellion had lasted only 2 days, but the fear it sparked would shape America for generations. To be continued in Part 6, The Legacy of Blood and Fear. Would you like me to continue Part 6 next? The aftermath, the laws, and how Turner's ghost haunted the South for decades. Title: The Confession of Nat Turner, Part 6, The Legacy of Blood and Fear. Engaging hook. When Nat Turner's body swung beneath the cold November sky, many thought the nightmare was finally over. But death did not silence him. His rebellion had cracked something open, something buried deep in the heart of America. And what came next was not peace, it was paranoia, vengeance, and the birth of a fear that would stain generations. Part 6. The Legacy of Blood and Fear. The crowd had gathered in Jerusalem, Virginia, that November morning to see the end of Nat Turner. They came dressed in their Sunday best, clutching their children's hands, whispering about demons and justice. When the trapdoor dropped, a cheer erupted. But by sunset, the cheer had turned to whispers again, uneasy, trembling whispers that spread across the South like wildfire. Because though Nat Turner's body was gone, his shadow had only grown larger. After the execution, his remains were treated not with the dignity of a burial, but with the cruelty of superstition. Some said the body was beheaded, the head paraded through town as a warning. Others claimed his skin was turned into souvenirs, his bones scattered, his skull passed around in secret. Whether true or not, the stories spread faster than truth could keep up, feeding the terror that haunted both black and white alike. That fear birthed new horrors. Across Virginia and neighboring states, white militias roamed the countryside, searching for anyone even suspected of sympathy for Turner's cause. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of enslaved men and women were beaten, tortured, or executed without trial. Rumors of uprisings, almost always false, sent entire towns into panic. A rustle in the fields, a candle burning too late at night, a whispered prayer, all could bring death. And so the South grew quieter, but it was not peace. It was the silence of terror. In the Virginia legislature, lawmakers met to discuss what had happened. Some argued that slavery itself had created the rebellion, that keeping men in chains was like sleeping beside a lit fuse. A few even dared to speak of emancipation. "If we do not end slavery," one delegate said, "it will end us." But fear shouted louder than reason. Instead of freedom, new laws were born, harsher, colder, more controlling. Enslaved people were forbidden to read or write. Preaching was banned unless a white man was present. Movement between plantations required written permission. The message was clear: knowledge was power, and power was forbidden. Every white family began to look over their shoulders, even at those they had trusted for years. Every black man was watched, every woman questioned, every prayer measured by who might be listening. The rebellion had lasted only 2 days, but it left decades of suspicion behind. In the North, the story spread differently. Abolitionists seized it, printing pamphlets and newspapers that told of Nat Turner's visions and courage. They called him a prophet, a martyr of freedom. But in the South, he was remembered as a monster. Each side crafted a ghost to serve its purpose, one of holy vengeance, the other of demonic rage. And in that divide, America began to fracture further. Thomas Gray's little pamphlet, The Confessions of Nat Turner, was printed and sold for a few coins each. It was meant to quiet the chaos, to show the world that Turner was just a madman. But instead, it did the opposite. People who read his words could feel something deeper, something unsettling. He did not sound insane. He sounded certain. He spoke of signs, of faith, of a God who demanded justice, not patience. Even those who hated him could not shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he had seen something real. Years passed, and the fields of Virginia went back to their rhythm, the planting, the harvesting, the endless labor. But strange tales began to surface. Some said that on nights when the moon turned red, whispers could be heard through the trees near Jerusalem. The sound of distant chanting, the clatter of chains, the cry of a man calling out scripture. Others swore they saw him, Nat Turner himself, standing on the ridge at twilight, his eyes glowing faintly, his head tilted toward the heavens. He never spoke, but his presence was enough to freeze the blood of anyone who looked too long. Plantation owners spoke in hushed tones about a curse. Crops failing, livestock dying without reason, children waking from nightmares of a man with fire in his hands. The rebellion was over, but the haunting had just begun. Decades later, when the Civil War finally came, soldiers marching through Virginia would still tell stories of him. Around campfires, they said that Nat Turner's ghost walked ahead of the Union lines, clearing paths through the fog. Some claimed that on the night of the Battle of Petersburg, lightning struck in the shape of a cross, and voices echoed through the thunder, "Let my people go." Even after the war, after slavery was abolished, Turner's name carried weight. To some, he was a warning of what happens when men push others too far. To others, he was proof that freedom sometimes demands blood. In time, scholars would debate his motives, writers would romanticize his life, and preachers would quote his words. But in the Deep South, among the descendants of those who had lived through his uprising, his story was not history, it was memory. Passed down in whispers, told at night, the kind of story that makes you check your doors twice before bed. Because legends never die, they wait. And Nat Turner's legend waited, through the Reconstruction, through Jim Crow, through every fire that burned in the name of freedom and vengeance. His rebellion was just a spark, but that spark still glows somewhere in the American soil, under the blood, under the fear, under the silence. One day, maybe, it will burn again. To be continued in Part 7, The Whispering Fields. Would you like me to continue with Part 7, where the story turns more supernatural? Ghostly sightings, cursed lands, and the mysterious hauntings that followed Turner's death across generations. Title: The Confession of Nat Turner, Part 7, The Whispering Fields. Engaging hook. They said the land where Nat Turner once walked could never grow quiet again. Some nights, the fields seemed to breathe, whispering with voices no wind could carry. The people of Southampton called it cursed soil, the kind that remembers blood. But as the years passed, one thing became clear: death had not buried Nat Turner's spirit. It had only set it free. Part 7, The Whispering Fields. It began with the harvest. The summer of 1832 was hotter than anyone could remember. The air was thick and heavy, the ground cracked like broken glass. In Southampton County, crops withered under the sun, animals grew sick, and farmers swore they heard strange sounds in the night. At first, they said it was just the heat. But then came the whispers. It started in the fields once owned by Joseph Travis, the place where Nat Turner's rebellion began. Workers there spoke of hearing murmured prayers carried by the wind, low and rhythmic, like chanting. At midnight, they said, the corn rustled though there was no breeze. The overseer laughed at first, called them superstitious fools. But one morning, he was found dead near the edge of the field, his face twisted in terror, his hands clutching at the dirt. The locals said he had heard the whispers, and answered them. Word spread quickly. Families moved away, leaving behind homes and barns to rot. The land itself felt different, like something beneath the soil was alive, breathing, waiting. Children were warned never to go near those fields after dark. But some dared anyway. One boy, no more than 12, claimed he saw a man standing at the edge of the corn rows, a tall figure with a faint glow around him, his head bowed as if in prayer. When the boy called out, the figure lifted its face. He said it was Nat Turner. And then the boy ran home screaming. By the time people reached the spot, there was nothing but the quiet rustle of leaves. But everyone noticed something strange. The footprints in the dirt were burned into the ground, as though fire had passed through them. From that night on, the name, Turner's Field, became a warning. Even travelers passing by would remove their hats and whisper a prayer. The years rolled on, but the stories never stopped. In 1851, a preacher from Richmond came to prove it was all nonsense. He spent a night in the old Travis farmhouse, armed with a Bible and a pistol. When he returned to town the next morning, his hair had gone completely white. He wouldn't speak for days. When he finally did, all he said was, "He walks still." By the time the Civil War came, soldiers on both sides refused to camp near those fields. Confederate patrols who ignored the warnings often vanished. Union troops who passed through claimed to hear voices chanting in rhythm with their footsteps, sometimes in English, sometimes in words they couldn't understand. A captain from Massachusetts wrote in his diary, "The air feels alive here. As if every gust of wind carries a soul." Even after the war, when the South lay in ruins and freedom had come at last, the whispers continued. The people who returned to rebuild found that the ground no longer yielded crops. The soil, once rich, had turned black and bitter. Rain refused to fall there. Lightning struck often but never burned anything. It was as if nature itself feared to disturb whatever slept below. Local folk began to treat the area like sacred ground. On the anniversary of the rebellion, they would leave candles at the edge of the fields, not out of fear, but respect. They said the whispers grew softer when the candles burned. But not everyone believed. In 1875, a group of young men, drunk on whiskey and pride, decided to spend the night there to prove the curse was just a story. They built a campfire and laughed as they retold tales of the rebellion. Sometime after midnight, one of them thought he saw movement in the corn. A shadow shifting between the stalks. He called out, thinking it was an animal. But the laughter stopped when a voice answered. It wasn't loud, but clear enough for all of them to hear. "The harvest has not ended." The fire flickered, then died. In the darkness, they heard the sound of chains dragging across the ground. Panic broke out. They ran, stumbling and screaming. When dawn came, only 2 made it back to town. The others were never found. What terrified the survivors most wasn't what they saw, but what they heard before they fled. A chorus of voices whispering behind them, not angry, not cruel, just repeating one phrase over and over. Remember. Over time, Turner's Field became a place no one entered willingly. Travelers avoided it. Maps stopped marking it. But sometimes, on quiet nights, those who lived nearby would still hear faint singing, hymns that no one had taught them, verses from the old slave spirituals that spoke of deliverance and blood and freedom. Some believed it was the spirits of those who had died in the rebellion, still waiting for judgment. Others said it was Nat Turner himself, guarding the souls of the innocent, watching over the land that had taken so much from his people. Whatever the truth, the whispers never stopped. Even into the 20th century, stories continued. Farmers plowing near the edge of the field claimed their tractors would stall for no reason. Photographs taken near the site came out blurred, as if something unseen was moving through the frame. One reporter who visited in 1928 described feeling an invisible pressure, like a crowd standing just behind me. By then, the legend of Nat Turner had evolved. To some, he was still a monster. To others, a prophet. But to those who lived near the field, he was something older, something eternal, the voice of the land itself, reminding everyone that freedom always has a price. And so, the whispers carried on through generations, a song of pain and pride tangled together. Some nights, the people of Southampton swear they can still hear it if they listen closely, a soft murmur through the trees, rising and falling like breath. A warning, a prayer, a promise, that the story of Nat Turner would never be forgotten. To be continued in Part 8, The Ghost Preacher. Would you like me to continue Part 8, where the haunting deepens, and a preacher claims Nat Turner's spirit has begun to speak through him to reveal unfinished divine justice? Title: The Confession of Nat Turner, Part 8, The Ghost Preacher. Engaging hook. They said the whispers had faded. That the fields of Southampton had finally grown quiet. But one autumn night, when the wind carried a voice that was not the wind, people realized something terrible: the dead were not resting. They were preaching, and one man was listening. Part 8. The Ghost Preacher. By the year 1881, the story of Nat Turner had become legend. Old men told it by firelight, their voices trembling with both fear and pride. Younger folks rolled their eyes, thinking it was just another ghost tale meant to scare children. But then came Reverend Elijah Boone, a preacher with a loud voice, a clean soul, and a secret that would make the county tremble once again. Reverend Boone arrived in Southampton from Richmond. He was tall, with eyes too deep for comfort. People said when he preached, you didn't just hear his words, you felt them. His church filled quickly. White folks came out of curiosity, black folks came out of faith, and everyone left shaken. Because when Boone spoke, his voice sometimes changed. It dropped low, heavy, like someone else was speaking through him. At first, people thought it was just passion. But then Boone began saying things no man could know, details about the rebellion, about the hidden graves, about the soldiers who had murdered in silence and never confessed. One Sunday, during a fiery sermon about redemption, Boone stopped suddenly. His body stiffened, his eyes rolled upward. When he spoke again, the congregation froze. The blood was never washed clean, he said, his voice now deep and unfamiliar. It soaks the ground still. They buried me beneath the roots, but the roots carried my name. The church fell silent. Someone whispered, "That's Nat Turner's voice." Boone collapsed. When he woke, he had no memory of what had happened. But word spread fast. Within days, people from miles around came to see the ghost preacher. Some came seeking salvation, others came out of fear. Boone didn't want the attention. He was a humble man. But at night, in his small room behind the church, he began to hear whispers. They called him by name. They spoke in soft, rhythmic tones, old words he didn't understand. He tried to pray, but the prayers twisted in his mouth. One night, he lit a candle and opened his Bible. The pages fluttered as if blown by a breath that wasn't there. The candlelight flickered, and for a moment, he saw the reflection of another man behind him in the glass, dark skin, calm eyes, and a faint scar on his forehead. "Why me?" Boone whispered. The voice behind him answered, "Because you listen." The next day, Boone told his congregation he'd been chosen to reveal the final confession of Nat Turner. People packed the small church until there was standing room only. Some wept before he even spoke. Others crossed themselves, unsure if what they were about to witness was holy or cursed. Boone stood at the pulpit, sweating, trembling. The air grew heavy. The lamps flickered. Then he began. The words that came were not his own. They poured out like water from a broken jar. He spoke of hidden suffering, of secret killings never recorded, of women who had buried their sons in silence. He named names, men long dead, men buried with pride who had never been punished. "Every act leaves a shadow," the voice said through him. "And the shadows do not fade." As he spoke, the people felt the air grow colder. Some said they could see figures forming in the corners of the church, dim outlines of men and women, their eyes like dark glass. A few ran out screaming. Others fell to their knees, sobbing. Boone fainted before finishing. He woke 3 days later, weak and confused. The local doctor said it was exhaustion. But Boone knew better. The spirits had chosen him. Over the next months, Boone stopped sleeping. The whispers grew louder, clearer. Sometimes he'd wake to find strange symbols drawn on his walls in charcoal, circles and crosses, like the ones used by enslaved people for protection. He swore he hadn't drawn them. One morning, he went to the old Travis farm, where the rebellion had begun decades before. The house was gone, burned long ago, but the land still carried that uneasy silence. Boone knelt and prayed, asking the voice what it wanted from him. The wind shifted. Then he heard it, soft footsteps in the grass behind him. When he turned, no one was there. Only a faint shimmer in the air, like heat rising from the ground. Then the voice came again. Tell them the truth. Tell them the price. That night, Boone returned to his church and began writing feverishly. For hours, he filled page after page. The words came too fast to think. When he finished, he realized he had written the entire confession of Nat Turner, not as history had recorded it, but as the spirit remembered it. It spoke of guilt, of vengeance, of divine fury and deep regret. It ended with a warning: the soil remembers. When men forget justice, the ground will speak again. Boone hid the papers in the church cellar. 2 days later, a storm struck Southampton. Lightning hit the church steeple, setting the building ablaze. By morning, it was nothing but ashes. The papers were never found. Reverend Boone disappeared that same night. Some said he fled in fear, unable to bear the burden of what he'd witnessed. Others swore they saw him walking into Turner's Field at dawn, holding a Bible that glowed faintly in the mist. He was never seen again. After that, the whispers returned, louder than ever. Travelers passing through the county claimed to hear two voices instead of one low and mournful, the other clear and fiery. The voices spoke together, like a sermon echoing across time. The blood was never washed clean, they said. And the story is not finished. Locals began to say that Nat Turner had not haunted the land alone anymore. The ghost preacher had joined him, bound by the same cause, preaching to the same unseen congregation in the dark fields of Virginia. And if you visit Southampton on a quiet autumn night, when the air is heavy and the moon hides behind the clouds, some say you can still hear it, the sound of a sermon rising from the soil. A warning, a confession, a promise that the truth, once spoken, never dies. To be continued in Part 9, The Night of Reckoning. Would you like me to continue Part 9, where the haunting spreads beyond Southampton, and strange events begin to plague those who try to erase the memory of Nat Turner's rebellion? Title: The Confession of Nat Turner, Part 9, The Night of Reckoning. Engaging hook. There are stories that stay buried because they're too heavy for the living to carry. But sometimes, the dead don't care what we can handle. Sometimes, they dig their own way back into the world, and when they do, the land remembers every drop of blood it ever drank. Part 9, The Night of Reckoning. By the 1890s, Southampton County had changed on the surface. Railroads cut through fields once soaked in blood. New homes stood where the old plantations had rotted away. But beneath the ground, nothing had truly changed. The earth still whispered. The roots still pulsed with old pain. And those who dared to disturb that soil soon learned why history should never be forgotten. It began one summer night when a group of railroad workers dug too deep near the old Travis property. They were laying new track for a line that would run straight through what locals called Turner's Hollow, a low stretch of land avoided by hunters and farmers alike. When the shovels struck something solid, they thought it was just an old tree root. But when one man bent down with his lantern, he froze. What the light showed wasn't wood. It was bone, a skull, cracked clean through the temple. The men stopped digging immediately, but the foreman, a tough man from Richmond, laughed it off. "This whole place is full of graves," he said. "You stop digging every time you find a bone, you'll never get anything done." He tossed the skull aside and ordered the crew to keep working. That night, the work site went silent. The next morning, the men were found dead, every one of them. Their tools still in their hands, eyes wide open, faces twisted in horror. There were no wounds, no blood, just the expression of men who had seen something no living soul should see. Word spread fast. The newspapers printed polite words like, "accident," and heat exhaustion. But the locals knew. They said the spirits of Turner's men had risen to defend their resting place. In the weeks that followed, strange things began happening across the county. Livestock were found mutilated. Wells turned red overnight. Families woke to the sound of drums beating faintly in the woods, though no one could find where the sound came from. In Jerusalem, the town that had once judged and executed the rebels, windows shattered in the courthouse with no wind and no vandals. One night, the church bell rang 13 times at midnight. The minister who went to investigate was found unconscious at the altar the next morning, whispering the same words over and over, "He's still preaching." People began leaving Southampton again, just as they had after the rebellion. Entire families packed up and moved west, saying they couldn't sleep through the noises. Some claimed they saw a figure walking along the railroad at night, holding a lantern that burned blue. The figure was tall and thin, his shadow stretching impossibly long. When approached, he would vanish into the mist. They called him the ghost preacher. A group of young men from Richmond decided to prove it was all nonsense. They brought cameras, whiskey, and bravado. On the night of August 21st, exactly 60 years to the day since the rebellion began, they camped at Turner's Hollow. They lit a fire and joked loudly, trying to show they weren't afraid. But when midnight came, the wind stopped. The fire burned lower, though no one touched it. The air grew thick. Then came the sound of footsteps, dozens of them, approaching through the dark. The men stood, eyes darting toward the woods. What emerged made their laughter die in their throats. It wasn't men. It was shadows, hundreds of them, tall and silent, moving like smoke but shaped like bodies. They carried no torches, no weapons, just the faint shimmer of moonlight through their outlines. One of the Richmond men screamed and fired his revolver. The bullet passed straight through the nearest figure, but instead of vanishing, it moved closer. They could hear breathing. They could smell sweat and iron. The sound of chains rattling filled the hollow. Then the voice came. It didn't come from the trees or the air, it came from inside their own heads, a deep, echoing voice that said, the blood was never washed clean. By morning, only one man made it back to town. He was half mad, eyes wild, mumbling about drums and fire and a man with a Bible that burned in his hands. He died 3 days later, refusing to go near any mirror or pool of water, saying they showed him faces that weren't his own. After that, the county closed the rail line. The workers refused to return, and the company declared the land unstable. They built the tracks around Turner's Hollow instead, leaving it untouched, just as it had been for nearly a century. But the hauntings didn't stop. Families living miles away claimed they could hear sermons on certain nights. Not human voices, but something older, heavier, filled with sorrow and fury. Farmers said their crops grew twisted on the nights the voices rose. Horses refused to cross the old roads that led toward the hollow. One man, a historian named Jacob Lyle, came to Southampton to research the rebellion. He wanted to write a book, to separate fact from myth. He interviewed the locals, walked the fields, even found what he believed was the location of Turner's original hiding place. When he returned to Richmond, he told friends he'd discovered something extraordinary, something that would rewrite American history. He never published the book. A month later, his house burned to the ground. His body was found in the study, surrounded by ashes and fragments of charred pages. On the one piece of paper that survived, only one sentence could be read: "He still walks." After that, people stopped digging for truth in Southampton. The past was too alive, too dangerous. Even today, locals say the land near Turner's Hollow feels strange. No birds sing there. No animals graze. And if you stand there long enough, you'll hear something, like the distant echo of a hymn carried on the wind. It's not a peaceful sound. It's a warning. The night of reckoning never ended. It's still happening, over and over again, every time someone tries to forget. Because the soil remembers. The ghosts remember. And Nat Turner's sermon still echoes beneath the ground, waiting for someone foolish enough to listen. To be continued in Part 10, the last sermon. Would you like me to write Part 10, the final part where the story reaches its haunting conclusion? tying Nat Turner's rebellion to modern times and revealing what happens when the past finally speaks through the present. Title: The Confession of Nat Turner, Part 10, The Last Sermon. Engaging hook. Some stories never end, they just wait for someone to listen again. When you walk the old roads of Southampton at night, you can still feel it. The air gets heavy, the trees lean closer, and if you're quiet enough, you'll hear it too, the voice of the preacher who wouldn't die. The one who promised that justice, once awakened, can never be buried. Part 10. The Last Sermon. Over 100 years had passed since the rebellion. The world had changed. Cars roared where horses once ran, and lights glowed where candles used to flicker. But in Southampton County, Virginia, there were still places that electricity refused to touch. Roads that maps ignored. Houses that stood empty because no one dared to live near them. One of those places was Turner's Hollow. Locals still warned travelers to stay away after dark. They said it wasn't just haunted, it was alive, like the ground itself was breathing. Teenagers from nearby towns would sometimes go there to prove they were brave. Most came back pale and quiet. Some didn't come back at all. In 1961, a young journalist named Paul Henson came to Southampton. He was writing an article for a northern magazine, marking the 130th anniversary of Nat Turner's rebellion. Paul didn't believe in ghosts or curses. He believed in facts. He wanted to tell the real story behind the legend. But what he found there changed his life, and his mind, forever. He arrived in Jerusalem on a hot August afternoon. The courthouse still stood. The old jailhouse where Turner had been kept was crumbling, its roof sagging like an old man's shoulders. The locals were polite, but cold. They didn't want to talk about the rebellion. When Paul mentioned Turner's name, people crossed themselves or looked away. That night, Paul drove to Turner's Hollow. The road was narrow and lined with ancient trees. The sun was setting, and the air felt wrong, too still, too thick. When he stepped out of the car, he noticed something strange. The crickets had stopped chirping. There wasn't a single sound, except for his own heartbeat. He found the remains of the old rail line and followed it deeper into the woods. His flashlight flickered, even though the batteries were new. Then, just as he reached what he thought was the center of the hollow, he saw a faint light in the distance, a bluish glow, pulsing like a heartbeat. He called out, thinking maybe someone else was there. But the voice that answered didn't come from the trees. It came from everywhere. "Do you still not see?" it said. Paul froze. The light grew brighter, and for a moment, he could make out shapes in the mist. Men standing in rows. Faces both young and old, their eyes burning like embers. At the front of them stood a tall figure holding a Bible that glowed with fire. Nat Turner. Paul tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The air pressed down on him like a weight. Then Turner spoke again, not with anger, but with a terrible calm. "The earth remembers. The blood remembers. Tell them." Paul's flashlight shattered in his hand. The light vanished. When he opened his eyes again, it was morning. His car was gone. His shoes were caked in mud. He stumbled back to town, confused and terrified. He told no one what he'd seen, not at first. But his article, when it was finally published, was unlike anything anyone expected. It wasn't just about history. It was a warning. He wrote, "I went to find a ghost. I found a truth instead. The rebellion never ended. It's in the soil. It's in the air. It's in every heartbeat of this country." The magazine printed it, and readers were captivated. Some called him a genius. Others said he'd gone mad. But a year later, Paul disappeared. His last letter, sent to his editor, contained just one line. "I heard the sermon again." After his disappearance, strange events started to happen. Across Virginia, fields that had been empty for years suddenly grew thick with wild vines. Storms came without warning, tearing through towns but sparing the old hollow. People began seeing the blue light again. One night, a preacher traveling through the county claimed he saw an entire congregation standing in Turner's Hollow, hundreds of figures, all silent, listening to something he couldn't hear. He said it wasn't a haunting. It was a gathering, a reckoning. By the 1980s, Southampton had become a quiet ghost town in parts. Farmers swore the ground near the hollow refused to grow anything but weeds. Dogs barked at nothing. Travelers told stories of hearing sermons carried on the wind, words they couldn't quite understand but felt deep in their bones. And then, in 1991, exactly 160 years after the rebellion, a violent thunderstorm struck the county. Lightning hit the courthouse, burning it to the ground. When the flames cleared, something strange was found among the ashes. A Bible, untouched. It wasn't modern. Its pages were brittle and yellowed, but inside the cover was a name written in fading ink, N. Turner. Scientists said it couldn't be real. Historians said it was a hoax. But locals knew better. They said it was his final message, brought back to remind the world of what it had buried. Today, Turner's Hollow is fenced off. The government calls it a protected historical site, but no one guards it. No one needs to. People don't go near it anymore. Still, sometimes, late at night, the glow returns. Travelers on the highway say they see a blue light rising from the trees and hear faint singing in the distance. The same hymn Nat Turner sang before his execution. Washed in the blood of the Lamb. Maybe it's just the wind. Maybe it's something else. But one thing's for sure, some ghosts never rest until their truth is told. And if you ever find yourself in Southampton County after midnight, and you feel the air shift, don't listen too closely. Don't follow the light, because the last sermon is still being preached, and it's not meant for the living. If this story sent chills down your spine, hit that like button and share it with someone who loves dark history and real American horror. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories where truth and terror walk hand in hand. Drop a comment below. Do you think Nat Turner's ghost still walks the fields of Virginia? Or are some legends too powerful to die?